They live together. They love together. They kill together. On the night of September the 10th, 1982, police in Rome, Georgia, received a frantic call from Ken Dooley. A unit was dispatched to his home.
The shooting at Ken Dooley's house began with a phone call.
Hello?
You're gonna pay.
A few minutes later, 4 shots slammed into Ken's house.
Police collected several bullets and canvassed the area, but no one had witnessed the crime.
If it's a one-time incident, unless you know who committed the crime, unless you have got specific information about the vehicle leaving the scene, it's very difficult to later on identify who committed that crime. And so it may lay there as an incident report and as a case that's still open, but because there are no leads, it may not be followed up on more than a week after the incident occurred.
The following night, at midnight, police were called to the residence of Linda Adair.
There was a phone call. Someone asked for Linda. And then not long after that, there was a firebombing at the house. Nothing like this had happened in her life. And while the police were there, they began to question people, look around. And at that point, someone, a neighbor, came and said that they had seen a car go by slowly. There was a man driving the car, and there was a young woman with brown hair.
Police looked for connections between the victims. They discovered that both Linda Adair and Ken Dooley worked for the Rome Youth Development Center, also known as the YDC.
Well, the YDC is a holding facility for juveniles under the age of 17. Adults go to jail. YDC is where a juvenile is detained.
Shortly after the attack at Linda Adair's home, police received an anonymous call.
Floyd County 911.
Yes, I'm calling about the shooting at Ken Dooley's house last night and the firebombing of Linda Adair's house tonight. For the sex abuse I went through in the YDC, they are both going to die.
Ken Dooley and Linda Adair were brought to the police station the next morning to listen to a recording of the call.
For the sex abuse I went through in the YDC, they are both going to die.
Police questioned them about the accusations.
These abuse claims were very thoroughly investigated. It was a serious accusation. There are a lot of girls in YDC, and there are certainly occasions for abuse. They were not able to authenticate any accusations.
With nothing more to go on, the case went cold. But less than 2 weeks later, things in Rome, Georgia, would heat up again. Early in September 1982, police in Rome, Georgia, investigated a shooting and a firebombing at 2 homes. Despite accusations from an anonymous phone caller, investigators were stumped. 2 weeks later, Rome police received a call about a missing girl. 13-year-old Lisa Ann Milikan had been at a shopping center with several girls and her house parent from a home for neglected children when she disappeared.
The sort of life that Lisa Ann Milikan had was a sad life by any measure. She was only 13 years old, and the problems in her home were such that she had already been removed from it 4 times.
After a search of the shopping center drew a blank, police interviewed Lisa's parents, as well as several of the home's residents and employees. None of them knew Lisa's whereabouts.
Because of the conditions of Lisa's life, and because she'd been placed in a girl's home, the police thought that she had certainly run away.
Not unique or unusual. That happens quite frequently. Kid will run away somewhere, or an adult, or she most likely was going home.
Three days after Lisa Milikan had gone missing, yet another anonymous call came into the police department.
Y'all looking for Lisa Ann Milikan? I can tell you where she is. Go up to Little River Canyon in Alabama. Just as you cross the Little River Canyon Bridge, go up into the national park and look off this side of the canyon where there's a power line going across it, and look straight down the canyon. And you'll find her where I left her.
It was a strange call. It really was. And I mean, you don't get people calling in very often saying, you know, you go to a certain place, you'll find somebody where I put them and I left them there. That's rare. That doesn't happen every day.
The Rome police immediately notified the authorities in Alabama.
Uniformed deputies were dispatched to that location, and I think they were accompanied by an Alabama state trooper. Initially, when they looked over into the canyon, they didn't see anything. They reported back that they didn't have any contact and left the scene.
Police assumed the call was a prank. A day later, the DeKalb County, Alabama police received a call from the same woman.
Go to the canyon where the power lines cross, and you will find a body with a bullet in it.
DeKalb officers returned to Little River Canyon. But once again, they found nothing.
I had left my car a little further than the rest of them. So when they departed, of course, I had to walk 5-6 minutes to get back to my car. And just on the rim of the canyon, there was a tree. And I reached out and got the tree with my right hand, held a flashlight in the left, and held my hand out over the rim of the canyon. I did it. The spot of the light was right in the back of the young girl.
If you walk up to the edge, you're looking down, but the edge extends out just a little bit, so when the body was thrown off or pushed off the canyon, it ultimately ended up sort of back up under the ledge. You had to actually lean out and look over to be able to see it.
On September the 29th, 1982, Lisa Milikan's body was found, 56 kilometers from the shopping center where she had last been seen.
We have a lot of evidence of killers who enjoy having their victims found so that they can see it reported in the newspapers, and because it helps them to glory in it. What good is it to have a victim that nobody knows about? So there's an added layer of feeling powerful and feeling as if you've taken a shot at the system.
As far as that particular moment, I think everybody was shocked. We're, of course, in a small town in rural North Alabama, and it's just, you don't see those crimes around here. That's something that you always hear about somewhere else, and it was just a tragedy.
Puncture wounds were visible on her neck, and she had been shot in the back.
About 50 feet from where the body was, we found a hand towel, a white hand towel, and inside that was 2 or 3 hypodermic syringes, and there was a pair of blue jeans in that same general area.
Police collected the evidence. An autopsy was performed on Lisa Milikan's body, and the syringes and jeans were sent to a forensics lab for analysis. While awaiting the results, investigators from Alabama and Georgia joined forces in the investigation. The authorities focused on the most promising piece of evidence, the recordings of the anonymous female caller.
We had found a report had been filed back in September. It was a female caller reporting a firebombing and a shooting into a residence of some employees of the YDC there in Rome, much the same as what had called in our case. And we were able to retrieve those tapes, sit down and physically listen to both of them.
It was the same person who had called about Lisa Milikan.
You know, you kind of think, well, you know, how does this hook together? Of course, it seems that the common denominator is the Youth Development Center. Sounds like a young girl. Lisa Ann Milikan's a young girl, so that's kind of where we concentrate on. Maybe the girls that we've gone through there in the last, you know, I guess immediate past.
And then you start pulling all the puzzle pieces together. Then you're going to go to your juvenile records, and you're going to pull in information and look at information to see if anything might fit in as a part of this puzzle. And so I'm looking at youth that might have been angry, youth that might have a reason to want to get back at the system. Anybody that's got that kind of grudge, I start looking through my files. And I start looking at all my cards and my case files, and I pull that information out. And one of the names that stands out is Judith Neelley. Judith and Alvin Neelley. Judith and Alvin's name stand out to me because of what they did previously, but because of their mobility. And because they hadn't been just to Rome, but they had been to other cities and they traveled around. They were separated here. Her children were removed from her here. She had been in YDC here. They had the opportunity and they had the ability to move around freely to do these different things.
Judith Neelley was born Judith Adams on June the 7th, 1964, in Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
Judith Neelley's early life was typical of girls of her age in the Southern working class. She was a good student. There was no reason to believe that her life would not go quite well, and that she would have a good, solid, ordinary life.
But when Judith was 9 years old, her father died in a motorbike accident, shattering her life.
This changed the circumstances of the family quite a bit. From now on, things deteriorated and spiraled down.
Judith's mother adopted a highly uninhibited lifestyle. She spent her days meeting men over her CB radio and inviting them over for sexual trysts. Her mother's behavior did not go unnoticed by the young and impressionable Judith.
Her mother appeared to have been a very promiscuous woman. If Judith was a reactive sort of personality or overly sensitive, she could have felt neglected, she could have been angry, and she could have stored that anger away until she could herself take it out on somebody else.
Alvin Neelley's childhood was very different.
Alvin Neelley's early life was rather charmed. He was loved by his family. He did not have an abused childhood whatsoever. He was greatly liked in school, greatly liked by both his teachers and his fellow students. He lived a very good life.
Even so, he turned to a life of crime.
Alvin was a sort of a petty criminal, I would say, nothing really serious. I think he was the type of person who just simply never got up in the morning and asked himself, how can I make an honest living? I think he could have lived his life in small cons, writing bad checks, skipping out on rent, robbing convenience stores, those kinds of crimes.
It was during one of her mother's liaisons that 15-year-old Judith met Alvin, 11 years her senior.
He said that the minute he saw her, he fell absolutely in love, that sparks absolutely flew. The same seems to be true of Judith.
He offered her this sense of an older male who had figured out a way to buck the system and to live a life that she saw as exciting, a life of crime.
Judith soon became pregnant. On July the 14th, 1980, one day before his 27th birthday, Alvin and 16-year-old Judith married in Georgia. The couple lived in several motels and robbed general stores as they moved from town to town.
Their relationship became an outlaw relationship, one forged in an outlaw life, which they both romanticized.
There was nobody to act as the parent and say, enough is enough. And as a result, they just continued to do what they were doing. Typically for people who repeat their crimes, especially if those crimes are exciting to them, they get addicted to a certain pattern. They want more. They're getting away with things. So pretty soon, that's not enough. And they get more and more aggressive.
The Neelleys first came to the attention of the Rome authorities in the autumn of 1980.
We didn't see 16-year-old, 9-month pregnant teenagers committing armed robberies.
The following day, Judith was arrested for trying to use a stolen check. She was placed in the YDC.
You're more likely to see a man committing the offense and maybe a female is in a secondary role. But in this case, Judith Neelley was the primary aggressor and very much 9 months pregnant. In fact, she gave birth 2 days after the robbery occurred.
Custody of Judith's newborn twins was granted to Alvin's mother.
I remember thinking, wow, this young girl, oh, golly, I mean, how was she raised or what's happened to her in life? Because she was venomous.
Alvin was also arrested for the armed robbery, for driving Judith to and from the scene. He was convicted and sentenced to up to 5 years in jail. During their separation, Judith wrote letters to Alvin, telling him she detested the YDC staff. She also made some shocking allegations.
She began to say that she was being raped there, that she was suffering all manner of sexual abuse, that people would not let her write to him. And I think she used this to make him jealous. He began to make promises to her of revenge when she was finally released.
The Neelley couple seemed to have had the kind of relationship where one of them instigated an act and the other went along with it. And so they had this sort of psychopathic chemistry.
She was an angry young woman, yet she could manipulate so well.
Judith was released in November 1981. Alvin followed in April 1982, and the two resumed their life together.
They began to fancy themselves as a criminal couple. They drove around in 2 cars, communicating by CB. He was Night Rider, she was Lady Sundown. They were vagabond criminals looking for that sort of hole-in-the-wall gang atmosphere, some place that they could go and live out this criminal fantasy.
Their fantasy life soon gave way to some very dark thoughts regarding the Youth Development Center.
she had made these terrible accusations, Alvin had responded with visions of revenge. They had goaded themselves up to some kind of vengeful action against their enemies in the YDC. And when you've talked it and talked it and talked it and talked it, you finally have to do something. And so they did.
In this case, we have a person driving it who's also very angry and wants to hurt other people. And so it's not surprising to find that they're emboldened by the petty crimes to now commit much more extreme violence.
Judith and Alvin's deviant behavior escalated to terrible new heights with the abduction and murder of Lisa Ann Milikan.
Why these acts turned into murder has to do with the continual effort to prove to each other that they are outlaws. So one act leads to another, but that next act must be somewhat worse. And then the next act, somewhat worse.
And the authorities feared that the Neelleys' recent crime spree was just the beginning. In the autumn of 1982, the authorities in Georgia and Alabama were searching for 18-year-old Judith Neelley and her husband, 29-year-old Alvin Neelley. The Neelleys were suspects in a series of crimes, including arson and murder.
What sets the case of Alvin and Judith Ann Neelley apart is that she seemed to be more of the instigator than we typically see in these teams.
He was more of the person who was doing what she told him to do.
It was as if it was her anger driving them, and the plans seemed to be from her. Usually you find that in the male member of the team with the female helping.
On October the 1st, the results came in from the evidence found near Lisa Ann Milikan's body. The blood on the jeans had come from Lisa, but the jeans were too large to have been hers, so police assumed they had belonged to the killer. The substance in the syringe contained sodium hydroxide and hypochlorite, the main ingredients in liquid drain cleaner. The autopsy on Lisa Ann Milikan confirmed the authorities' fears.
Lisa had been tortured prior to her murder by the injection of liquid drain cleaner into her neck, into her arms, and into both buttocks.
The autopsy also revealed that Lisa Ann Milikan had been sexually assaulted. The authorities realized they were dealing with extremely vicious criminals and were determined to get them off the street before they could strike again. On October the 3rd, reports came in to the Rome Police Department about a woman matching Judith Neelley's description, who'd been accosting and attempting to pick up young women and girls.
We began to look at the attempted pickups, the attempted abductions, and it was pretty obvious to us at that point that, we had the potential of a serial killer on the loose.
That night, 26-year-old John Hancock and his fiancée, 22-year-old Janis K. Chattman, were walking home after visiting family.
The way Judith lures people into her car is by playing the small-town girl in a new town. She would come up to people and say that she was new in town and that she was friendless, and then she would invite those people to go riding with her in her car.
John and Janis believed Judith's story and took her up on her offer. The three drove through the Georgia countryside.
During the course of the drive, she gets into contact with CB radio with someone who's called Night Rider. They begin to chat, and Judith says that she has some new friends in the car with her, and perhaps that all of them should meet.
Hey, John, just come here for a second.
Oh, okay. You got it in control now.
Hold on. Hey, John.
Yeah.
Come here.
Okay.
After they all meet up, they split up. John goes with Alvin. Janis goes with Judith. The decision is made to try to find some moonshine to liven things up for the evening, and they head out into a more deserted area to look for that.
Judith and Janis followed Alvin and John.
During that ride, John needs to go to the bathroom. He asks Alvin to pull over, and Alvin does.
Judith shot John Hancock, and the Neelleys left with Janis K. Chattman, who was restrained in the car.
But John isn't dead, and after he knows they're gone, he gets up and he runs to the nearest road, flags down a passing car, still quite wounded, of course, and goes to the hospital.
John Hancock was treated and released.
He came to the wrong police department the next day. He came through the general investigative area where we were sitting, the squad room. We were playing back the tape of the phone call.
And you will find a body with a bullet in it.
And as he walked by, he heard the voice, and he stopped and turned around and he said, "That's her. That's the girl that shot me." At that point, we all sat down with Mr. Hancock and began to try to solicit as much information from him as we could.
Hancock picked Judith and Alvin Neelley out of a photo lineup.
At that point, our investigation turned to the point of, we've got them identified, now let's find them. We still had a victim, Janis Chattman, that had not been located. Our primary focus at that time was two things. Number one, we wanted to locate Janis Chattman, try to get her to safety. The other thing was to locate Alvin and Judy Neelley and get them off the street.
Georgia and Alabama authorities, now joined by federal agents, searched across several states for the Neelleys. And for Janis Chattman, who they hoped to find before it was too late.
It was urgent. We got people running around Rome killing folks.
More than a week went by with no results. A nationwide bulletin was issued for Judith and Alvin Neelley. On October the 14th, investigators finally got a break.
We contacted the authorities in Tennessee, the area that they were known to have been from, and were fortunate enough to find that Alvin and Judy were both in the Rutherford County Jail in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, on some check charges, some forgeries, something totally unrelated to this. I think it was probably 4 or 5 carloads of us that drove up there, and then we divided into 2 search teams and went and searched the automobiles of Alvin and Judy Neelley, and also the residence of Judy's mother, where they were in fact staying.
Among the items police found were guns, handcuffs, CB radios, motel receipts under several aliases, and the letters Judith had written to Alvin when she was in the YDC. But there was no sign of Janis K. Chattman. Investigators interrogated Judith first, hoping she'd tell them where they could find Janis Chattman.
She was very cold, very, matter of fact, she showed absolutely no emotion. But Judy admitted that they had picked up Chattman and John Hancock. She admitted to walking him out into the woods, shooting him in the back, leaving him for dead. She went on to say that they carried Miss Chattman back to a motel there in Rome and killed her.
She shot her in the back, and then when she fell and was hollering, that was the word she used, Judy went over to her and put 2 more bullets in her head as she lay on the ground.
Judith also confessed to murdering Lisa Ann Milikan.
She admitted that she'd picked Lisa Milikan up. They spent the night in a motel, that Alvin, in fact, joined them at that particular motel.
Judith watched as Alvin raped 13-year-old Lisa.
Judith Neelley seemed to have a condition where someone gets excited at watching another person be violent. Judith Neelley might have enjoyed watching her husband raped, either because she just liked to see that kind of violence against another woman, or because there was an element of self-hatred in it where she could envision herself as the woman being raped.
Judith Neelley tried to kill Lisa 7 different times. She injected her 6 times with a solvent used to clean drains, but that didn't work. Time was passing, Judith grew impatient, and so finally she asked Lisa to stand up beside the edge of the canyon, and there she shot her in the back. After Lisa was dead, to Judith's surprise, she was still at the top of the canyon. And so Judith got down on her knees and pushed the body over the side. When that happened, she got her jeans bloody, and so she changed her jeans and threw those over this canyon wall. She also threw the syringes that she had used to inject Lisa over the side of the canyon.
For her to take the blame in this case, it certainly could be that she was so immature as to believe that these crimes really weren't that damaging and that it made her powerful and she enjoyed it.
Alvin Neelley corroborated Judith's story and provided police with the location of Janis Chattman's body. They found it exactly where he said it would be. She had been shot 3 times.
Alvin Neelley gave me the impression of being a big old lapdog. IQ-wise, I would say she would double or triple him. I just felt like that she was extremely intelligent, and he felt like that well, I'm lucky to have this woman, you know, and so if I don't do what she says, she'll leave. But it was obvious to me that she was in charge.
Alvin admitted to raping both Lisa Ann Milikan and Janis Chattman.
He claimed that Judith was in it for the sex, too. There was never any evidence of that. However, I think that the primary motive was this outrageous notion of being outlaws, that it was exceedingly important to really be bad people.
A question that we always ask when we're looking at team killers is, would they separately have had the propensity to be murderers? I think in terms of what we know about Alvin up to the point when they met, he showed no indication that he really was a killer. And yet with Judith, we certainly see that she's got that kind of anger. She follows through on revenge. She has agendas against people. He probably wouldn't have been a killer, but she probably would have been.
On October the 16th, just over a month after their crime spree had begun, Judith and Alvin Neelley were extradited to Alabama to face charges in the death of Lisa Ann Milikan.
We never had any evidence or proof that he committed a crime in our jurisdiction.
I think it was a power thing for Judy. She wanted to be in charge. She wanted to let somebody know that she had done it, and it was her way of saying, here I am.
But faced with a 3-count indictment of abduction with intent to harm, abduction with intent to terrorize and sexually violate, and murder, Judith applied for youthful offender status in the hope of avoiding a death sentence.
Had she been granted that status, her maximum punishment would have been 3 years only.
After considering Judith's past criminal history, as well as the shocking details of Lisa Ann Milikan's death, the court denied the motion. Her trial was set for March the 7th, 1983. When the date arrived, a new Judith Neelley showed up in court.
She had nice clothes on, and she had makeup, and her hair was done nicely, and I'm sure her attorneys thought that was what she should do, and if I had been them, I would have done the same thing.
When Judith took the stand, the prosecution learned that her look wasn't the only thing that had changed.
When she was first arrested, she was very sure of herself. When it got to trial, she became very demure. She seemed to have a very introverted personality and tried to show all the signs of someone who might be brainwashed or coerced.
Judy had claimed that Alvin had made her do these things, that she had had no part in them other than to act as his zombie.
Typically in these situations, what happens is the most psychopathic person turns on the other fast so that they can throw the blame on that person.
Alvin Neelley was portrayed by the defense as being this big, brutal guy who terrorized and brutalized his wife. Anybody who met Alvin Neelley, which included myself, the investigators, anybody who ever had contact with him, was immediately impressed by how inaccurate that description was. Once when she was testifying, she bent her head over and appeared to be crying. We'd never seen her cry before. I stopped the court and I asked the court to instruct her to lift her face, to lift her head. The court made her lift her head. There was total dry eyes, no crying, no tears, no nothing. Only through things like that could we show the real Judith Neelley.
On March the 21st, after 13 days of testimony, Judith's case went to the jury. The next morning, they returned a verdict. Guilty on all 3 counts. They recommended a sentence of life in prison.
Under Alabama law in a death penalty case, the jury returns a verdict and recommends a punishment. The judge must make the final decision.
The judge rejected the jury's recommendation and sentenced Judith Neelley to death.
It was the judge's determination that if you couldn't execute Judith Neelley in the state of Alabama for the crime of which she had been found guilty, you couldn't execute anybody.
The only time I ever saw true tears from her was when the court handed down the death sentence. Then she cried.
At the age of 18, Judith became the youngest woman in America ever given a death sentence. But the twisted saga of Judith Neelley wasn't over yet. In March 1983, Judith Neelley was sentenced to die for murdering 13-year-old Lisa Ann Milikan.
I certainly walked away from the trial of that case with the feeling that justice had been served.
Judith was then sent to Georgia, where, along with her husband Alvin Neelley, she faced charges in the abduction and murder of Janis Chattman and the kidnapping and attempted murder of John Hancock. Not wanting to risk another death sentence, Judith agreed to testify against Alvin in exchange for the state dropping the charges of murder and attempted murder and allowing her to plead guilty to kidnapping.
Alvin was confronting very serious offenses, and if he confessed, then he would not be electrocuted.
Alvin pleaded guilty to the kidnapping and murder of Janis Chattman and received 2 life terms.
He simply chose to live in prison until the end of his days than to face the electric chair.
Judith was given a life sentence. She was then returned to Alabama's death row. She remained there in relative obscurity until May 1994, when the body of a young woman was found in a home in Gadsden, a small city in Alabama.
When Judith Neelley was in the penitentiary, she formed a relationship with a young woman in that county, and they entered into a suicide pact. This was not discovered until the body of that young woman was discovered, and she had left notes, messages, letters from Judith Neelley. And when those were discovered and the suicide pact was revealed, the penitentiary was notified immediately.
Judith Neelley was found in her cell with her wrists slit. She survived. It wasn't the last time she escaped death.
Years later, the governor of Alabama commuted her sentence to life. Not from death to life without parole, but from death to life. So the issue of parole will be something that will have to be faced in one way or another in the future.
On October the 24th, 2005, while serving out his sentence, Alvin Neelley died from complications while undergoing surgery. Judith Neelley will be eligible for parole in 2013 at the age of 49.
She's been in jail a long time, and she needs to stay in jail a long time.
She claims to have to be active in religious activity now, and that she's changed. But that's the same song that most people that go to jail sing. In my opinion, Judy Neelley is probably one of the most dangerous women in 1982, and I think she probably still is today.
If somebody were to say, do you have any examples of a woman who really was a killer, a cold-blooded killer, she springs to mind pretty fast. Despite the fact that she may have a lower victim count, the aggression, the anger, the manipulativeness, and the cleverness of what she was doing does stand out. But I also think because Alvin was much older than her and much more experienced, had been to prison, had done a lot of the petty thefts, that he was probably the dominant partner in terms of how they got money, the fact that they ran around as much as they did, and so each had a part in how they operated.
There are certain relationships that simply combust into some kind of fiery element. And I think that's what happened in the case of Mr. and Mrs. Neelley. And I believe that if they were to have met in a corridor or in a jail somewhere long after this trial, they would have shared a wink and a smile.
Will Kat warm to the idea of touring with Nikki? New LA Ink is tomorrow at 9. Next, though, it's an honest day's work from Miss Von D as she shows off her